1851. Fiat. A command. B. To take back. C. To rebuke. D. A stupid fellow. 1852. Histrionic. A. Imaginary. B. A twisting. C. Theatrical. D. Disguised. 1853. Reprehensible. A. The most perfect example. B. Deserving criticism. C. Pertaining to the lungs. D. Poorly written verse. 1854. Epithet. A descriptive phrase, an uncomplimentary name. B. A medicine or anything else that quiets and deadens. C. A bog, a difficult situation. D. One whose interest is directed outside himself. 1855. Disquisition. A. Passing from one subject to another. B. Taking something upon oneself without permission, forwardness. C. To make unclear, to confuse. D. A formal inquiry, an elaborate essay. 1856. Assuage. A. Clever, shrewd. B. Changeable. C. To lessen. D. To assign or attribute. 1857. Introvert. A. To surround, to prevent, something, by cleverness. B. Producing a lot of children, fruit, or ideas. C. Refusing to agree or compromise. D. A person who looks inside himself more than outside. 1858. Mutinous. A. Inclined to rebel or revolt. B. Having a pleasant odor. C. Power to have effect. D. An attack. 1859. Revulsion. A. Very careful in doing what is correct. B. A sudden change in feeling, disgust. C. A painting done on fresh plaster. D. A word or phrase, a style of speech. 1860. Funereal. A. A rowdy drinking party. B. To restrain or hold back. C. Appropriate to funerals. D. Clear, easy to understand. 1861. Mesa. A. To take back, a belief or statement. B. A crowd, a space for crowds to gather. C. A high, flat land with steep sides. D. moving from place to place. 1862. Machiavellian. A. Crafty and deceitful. B. A group of islands. C. Curable, correctable. D. A slanderous remark. 1863. Dogmatic. A. Pertaining to a comma. B. Poorly written verse. C. To bring to completion, to finish. D. Positive in manner or in what one says. 1864. Inchoate. A. To adjust or regulate. B. Just begun, incipient. C. To cancel by authority. D. Trickery or deception. 1865. Accrue. A. To stir up. B. To assault. C. To accumulate. D. To reduce or exhaust. 1866. Affront. A. Twisted. B. A summary. C. Forceful. D. An insult. 1867. Scapegoat. A. A mutual relationship, a correspondence. B. To fascinate. C. To lean to the side or from side to side. D. One who is blamed for the wrongs of another. 1868. Matrix. A. A great number. B. A warning. C. A dye or mold. D. A flowing in. 1869. Relegate. A. To send away to some place. B. To return injury or evil in kind. C. To lessen in value. D. Providing for future needs. 1870. Mercantile. A. Pertaining to merchants or trade. B. Pertaining to the bearing of genetically healthy offspring. C. Surroundings, vicinity. D. An angry argument. 1871. Consanguinity. A. Blood relationship, close relationship. B. A vehicle or other means of carrying. C. Given freely, unwarranted. D. The state of being oblique. 1872. Munificent. A. to prove wrong. E. Generous, lavish. C. To make up with. D. Ornate, showy. 1873. Fledgling. A. A young bird that has his feathers, an immature person. B. Not understandable by most people, obscure. C. Relevant and pertinent to the case at hand. D. Tending or leading. 1874. Bombastic. A. To confine or hold back. B. Using unnecessarily pompous language. C. Moving or walking about. D. Practical, dealing with daily matters. 1875. Impair. A. To make worse or weaker, to reduce. B. A water nymph, a female swimmer. C. To sting, to irritate or annoy. D. To turn aside or deviate, especially in writing or speaking. 1876. Reprobate. A. Holding, able to remember. B. Restoration, reimbursement. C. A person of no principles. D. Just begun, incipient. 1877. Cortege. A. Slaughter. B. A procession. C. To call together. D. Strong point. 1878. Gradation. A. Producing or tending to dissension. B. Arrangement by grades or steps. C. Happening again one or more times. D. The killing of one's father. 1879. Abet. A. Loyalty. B. To aid. C. To assemble. D. Amaze. 1880. Contingent. A. To revoke an order. B. Happening again one or more times. C. Possible, accidental, depending on something else. D. A vote by the people on a political issue. 1881. Diabolical. A. A guess. B. Gigantic. C. Wealthy. D. Devilish. 1882. Circumspect. A. Flagrant. B. Cautious. C. A question. D. Sarcastic. 1883. Insensate. A. Pertaining to the climax, or high point. B. One's face and facial expressions. C. To sink downward, to predominate. D. Not feeling, inanimate, insensitive. 1884. Acquit A. Speaking very little B. To accumulate C. To blot out, to erase D. To clear of a charge. 1885. Putative. A. Close inspection B. Fearless C. Reputed D. To belittle. 1886. Affinity. A. To kill a large part of B. A delay, a let up C. Every 2 years D. A close relationship. 1887. Eclectic. A. Dead, no longer operating B. Made up of material collected from many sources C. To make unfriendly D. A pirate or pirate ship. 1888. Perversion. A. To hand over, to put in the care of another B. Developing earlier than usual C. A worker who has learned a trade D. An abnormal form, a twisting or distortion. 1889. Partiality. A. Being improper B. Immoral, wasteful C. Minor details D. Bias, prejudice. 1890. Discursive. A. Passing from one subject to another. B. Pertaining to festivity, sociable C. A vehicle or other means of carrying. D. Happening at the same time. 1891. Askance. A. A narrow opening or cleft B. With a sideways look, suspiciously. C. Pertaining to names, slight D. To talk or write strongly, against. 1892. Lithe. A. Flexible, limber. B. Easily tricked C. Vulgar, coarse. D. Prudent, crafty. 1893. Libidinous. A. Accidental B. Abominable. C. Absurd D. Lustful, lewd. 1894. Obnoxious. A. Conspiracy. B. Offensive C. Lazy, idle. D. The act of spreading something out in all directions. 1895. Enormity. A. Great wickedness B. False reasoning. C. To appropriate D. To make right. 1896. Disseminate. A. To captivate. B. To build, to lie C. A forefather. D. To scatter. 1897. Apotheosis. A. To assert B. To disable. C. Deification D. Merrymaking. 1898. Fiduciary. A. Encouraging, giving advice. B. Pertaining to one who holds something in trust for another C. Left to one's judgment, despotic. D. Happening at the same time. 1899. Effectual. A. Fleeting B. To expand. C. Lying D. Efficient. 1900. Maritime. A. Pertaining to the sea. B. Worldly, commonplace C. To fascinate. D. To blame or criticize. 1901. Resuscitate. A. Unable to be overcome B. Lush, rich. C. To thrive D. To revive. 1902. Recumbent. A. Existing from birth. B. To blot out, to erase C. Ingenuity, trickery. D. Lying down, resting. 1903. Contortion. A. A blessing B. Harsh sound. C. A twisting D. Corresponding. 1904. Presumption. A. The surrender by one state to another of an alleged criminal. B. An idea suggested by a word or phrase that is different from the literal meaning of the word or phrase C. A formal inquiry, an elaborate essay. D. Taking something upon oneself without permission, forwardness. 1905. Lacuna. A. Violent emotional excitement B. A gap where something is missing. C. Brief, using few words D. To ward off, a blow, to evade. 1906. Magniloquent. A. A critical comment. B. Cool, indifferent C. Lofty or pompous. D. A steep slope. 1907. Malcontent. A. Discontented. B. Cool, indifferent. C. A wrongdoing. D. A part of the whole. 1908. Malevolent. A. Yellow, prejudiced. B. To think out ahead of time. C. Wishing ill to others. D. Hostile, in opposition. 1909. Culpable. A. Filthy, foul. B. To improve. C. Blameworthy. D. Early chemistry. 1910. Evince. A. To make evident, to display. B. To withdraw, to rescind. C. The point nearest the Earth in an orbit. D. To sketch or design, to portray. 1911. Gregarious. A. Tending to flock together. B. Unable to be touched, impalpable. C. A feeling of well-being. D. Going backward. 1912. Pretentious. A. Pushy in calling attention to oneself. B. Claiming greatness, showing off. C. The impact of one thing against another. D. Taking something upon oneself without permission, forwardness. 1913. Capricious. A. Erratic, changeable. B. Pertaining to horses. C. To fascinate. D. Inclined to dispute. 1914. Chagrin. A. To bear fruit. B. To think over. C. Embarrassment. D. To enlarge. 1915. Ominous. A. Threatening. B. A mouth or opening. C. To captivate. D. Shining. 1916. Apparition. A. Fearful. B. A ghost. C. Introductory. D. Harmful. 1917. Nonplus. A. To give up. B. To expand. C. To perplex. D. Laborious. 1918. Pertinent. A. To soak. B. Relevant. C. Apparent. D. Reasoning. 1919. Autocrat. A. Aimless, random. B. A dictator. C. Minor details. D. Deception. 1920. Prowess. A. Boldness, skill. B. To scold sharply. C. Wonderful, huge. D. Loose in morals. 1921. Regeneration. A. Humorous, joking. B. Extremely proud. C. Renewal, rebirth. D. Abnormal, supernatural. 1922. Drudgery. A. Forgetfulness. B. Sudden paralysis. C. Tiresome work. D. Close inspection. 1923. Extradition. A. To imitate with the hope of equaling or surpassing. B. Guilt, remorse. C. To explode suddenly, to thunder forth verbally. D. The surrender by one state to another of an alleged criminal. 1924. Livid. A. Black and blue, lead-colored. B. An intolerant person. C. To cheat or deceive. D. An overworked expression. 1925. Grandiose. A. To pardon or overlook. B. Imposing, splendid. C. Strength, courage. D. Ingenuity, trickery. 1926. Obliterate. A. To wipe out. B. To rub out. C. To make known. D. To repeat. 1927. Dogma. A. A belief or doctrine, a positive statement of opinion. B. Not aligning oneself with any side or point of view. C. A high, flat land with steep sides. D. A basic principle, a first stage. 1928. Inadvertent. A. Heedless, unintentional. B. The highest point. C. A critical comment. D. Unable to be conquered or entered. 1929. De facto. A. Shining. B. A scholar. C. Actual. D. Lustful. 1930. Behemoth. A. Freedom from punishment or harm. B. A crowd, a space for crowds to gather. C. A large and powerful animal or thing. D. An elaborate architectural design. 1931. Predicate. A. To state is a quality of someone or something, to affirm B. To turn aside C. A systematic persecution or killing of a group D. To dry up. 1932. Concourse. A. An elaborate architectural style. B. A crowd, a space for crowds to gather. C. To mount with one leg on each side. D. Wrong or corrupt, perverted, stubborn. 1933. Grueling. A. Conspiracy. B. Punishing. C. Accumulation. D. Eagerness. 1934. Reciprocal. A. Pertaining to tailors or clothing. B. Done in return, occurring on both sides. C. More than enough, wordy. D. One with expert knowledge and taste in an area. 1935. Nutrient. A. Wronged. B. A food. C. Across. D. To soak. 1936. Probity. A. Children or descendants. B. Honesty. C. Creed. D. Heavenly. 1937. Brusque. A. Perfect happiness. B. Threatening. C. Abrupt in manner. D. Balky, unruly, restless. 1938. Foist. A. One who gets pleasure from hurting others. B. Deserved or suitable. C. To pass off fraudulently. D. To prove wrong. 1939. Quiescent. A. Minor details. B. Inactive. C. To deceive, to lie. D. An insult. 1940. Clemency. A. Sleeping, inactive. B. Leniency. C. A defense. D. Self-denying. 1941. Arboreal. A. Pertaining to money. B. Pertaining to trees. C. Pertaining to the stars. D. Meaning, significance. 1942. Buxom. A. Healthy, plump. B. To delay, to object. C. To polish. D. To call forth. 1943. Irony A. To eat away B. Unfit, clumsy. C. Powerless to move, slow D. Humor in which one says the opposite of what he means, an occurrence that is the opposite of what is expected. 1944. Militate. A. Pertaining to the CB. To work against. C. To call together D. To tear or mangle. 1945. Analogous. A. Comparable B. To appease C. To encircle D. To overfill. 1946. Naiad A. Black and blue, lead-colored B. Of great size, strength, or courage C. To pass off fraudulently D. A water nymph, a female swimmer. 1947. Cower. A. Attractive B. To shrink in fear C. Pertaining to money D. To renounce. 1948. Citadel. A. Minor details B. A fortress C. To correct D. Hard to grasp. 1949. Annuity. A. Wasteful, generous B. A have to happen C. Like a dandy D. A yearly payment. 1950. Savant. A. A hobby. B. A curse C. To worry or torment. D. A scholar. 1951. Invidious. A. Offensive B. A forerunner. C. Self-denying D. Bitterness. 1952. Wrote. A. To praise. B. Harry C. To offer. D. Routine. 1953. Abeyance. A. To produce by magic B. Free of bacteria. C. Temporary suspension D. To strike out or erase. 1954. Ostracize. A. Inclined to dispute. B. Profitable C. To banish or exclude. D. To think out ahead of time. 1955. Flaunt A. To worry or torment B. To produce by magic. C. Meaning, significance D. To show off, to display. 1956. Prolific. A. Pertaining to an uncle, like an uncle. B. Producing a lot of children, fruit, or ideas. C. To lessen or ease pain, to excuse. D. Growing or living in a particular area. 1957. Insurgent. A. Something thrown in or interrupted with an exclamation. B. Pertaining to one who holds something in trust for another. C. Marriage between a man and a woman of different races. D. A person who rises up against political authority. 1958. Hierarchy. A. Providing for future needs. B. An error in social behavior. C. Obscure, not easily understood. D. An arrangement in order of rank. 1959. Deplore. A. To feed and or raise a child. B. To lament or feel sorry about. C. To plunder or despoil. D. Something or someone hated or feared. 1960. Generic. A. Pertaining to night. B. Burdensome. C. Pertaining to a whole class, kind, or group. D. A statement of belief, religious or otherwise. 1961. Indubitable. A. Unquestionable. B. Uncertain, risky. C. To fascinate. D. A name or title. 1962. Convene. A. To assemble. B. An inhabitant. C. To waste. D. To disembowel. 1963. Neurosis. A. A man of business. B. A pain reliever. C. A mental disorder. D. A standard for judging. 1964. Confute. A. To pick or select. B. To bring to life. C. To prove wrong. D. To unite. 1965. Longevity. A. Indifferent. B. Keen, sharp. C. Long life. D. Introductory. 1966. Refractory. A. A hobby. B. Weakness. C. Harsh sound. D. Stubborn. 1967. Laudatory. A. Profitable. B. Unfeeling. C. Praising. D. Efficient. 1968. Pied. A. Pale. B. Spotted. C. A daydream. D. To drink. 1969. Glutinous. A. Gluey. B. Bold. C. Huge. D. Deadly. 1970. Harass. A. To abuse, to scold. B. To draw. C. To worry or torment. D. A failing or weakness. 1971. Martial. A. Acting overly dainty or elegant. B. To act dreamily or vaguely. C. Pertaining to war or the military, warlike. D. The killing of one's father. 1972. Attribute. A. A characteristic. B. A deviation. C. Incapable of error. D. A mouth or opening. 1973. Rebuke. A. To produce by magic. B. The food of the gods. C. To scold sharply. D. To discuss at length. 1974. Demise. A. To delay, to object. B. Remainder. C. Death. D. Friendly. 1975. Cash. A. To make someone feel ashamed. B. To make unclear, to confuse. C. Producing or tending to dissension. D. A hiding place, hidden things. 1976. Gibbet. A. Complete, out and out. B. Opposed. C. Gallows. D. Careful, wise. 1977. Categorical. A. Praising. B. Absolute. C. Separated. D. Assertion. 1978. Incursion. A. An inroad, a brief raid. B. A model of perfection. C. A sudden change in feeling, disgust. D. To kill a large part of. 1979. Bland A. Mild B. Amusing and strange. C. Edible D. Blissful. 1980. Rectify. A. To make receptive. B. To make right. C. To pacify. D. To decrease. 1981. Berate. A. To support. B. To quote. C. To reveal. D. To scold. 1982. Objurgate. A. Corruption. B. To soak. C. To rebuke. D. To give up. 1983. Misnomer. A. A group of associates or attendants. B. One who is helped in his career by another. C. Pertaining to the kitchen or cooking. D. The wrong name applied to something. 1984. Altruism. A. Conducive to good health. B. Unselfish concern for others. C. A condition that one must meet. D. An example or model. 1985. Requiem. A. A mob, the masses. B. An authoritative statement. C. A mass or music for the dead. D. To make someone feel ashamed. 1986. Anomaly. A. An abnormality. B. A dilemma. C. Wise and pithy. D. A linking up. 1987. Incriminate. A. To accuse of a crime, to involve in a crime. B. Done in return, occurring on both sides. C. Lacking, in extreme need of things. D. To lessen or ease pain, to excuse. 1988. Expedite. A. To involve, to imply. B. To support. C. The killing of a parent. D. To speed up or make easy. 1989. Metaphysical. A. Pertaining to the nature of being or reality. B. Pushy in calling attention to oneself. C. A mutual relationship, a correspondence. D. Having few distinguishing qualities, hard to classify. 1990. Graphic. A. Vivid, pertaining to writing. B. Land, left unplanted during a growing season. C. Children or descendants. D. Rural, pastoral. 1991. Investiture. A. Pertaining to a demon or demons. B. An idea that persists in the mind. C. Having strong sexual desire or lust. D. The giving of office to someone. 1992. Insular. A. Positive in manner or in what one says. B. Like an island, isolated, narrow-minded. C. To transfer to another person. D. To carry on light love affairs. 1993. Caustic. A. To prove wrong. B. Across. C. To propose. D. Corrosive. 1994. Impasse. A. A situation with no escape or solution. B. A choice of two unsatisfactory alternatives. C. To lament or feel sorry about. D. A favorite, follower, a subordinate. 1995. Anarchy. A. A motion of reverence. B. Absence of government. C. A close relationship. D. To seize by authority. 1996. Perforce. A. An offering. B. Necessarily. C. Short-lived. D. Sudden paralysis. 1997. Indulgent. A. Belittling the worth of something or someone. B. Pertaining to punishment. C. To imitate with the hope of equaling or surpassing. D. Giving in to one's own desires, kind or lenient. 1998. Limb. A. Pertaining to or produced by fire. B. To paint or draw, to describe in words. C. To order, to prohibit. D. Violent emotional excitement. 1999. Mimetic. A. Imitative. B. Helping the memory. C. Domineering. D. To pacify. 2000. Factitious. A. A dictator. B. Lustful, lewd. C. Artificial. D. Uncivilized.